support your state trooper.
I'm Trooper Dave Levandusky of the Indiana State Police.
Can you give me your first name and your last name and your PE number?
Fred Hayes, PE 1313, the lucky 1313.
Can you give me the date you were sworn in and when you retired?
I was employed as an operations clerk in May of 1963, and I served there until September of 1964 when I was sworn in as a trooper.
And when did you retire?
January of 1996.
What made you want to become a trooper?
I had an experience when I was a child. A trooper friend of my father's had built a new home, and we had a small farm. And I came off the bus one day, and there was a trooper car sitting in the driveway. Well, I just walked away on that thing till Dad got home. Well, the trooper had borrowed our tractor and some farming equipment to do landscaping. And so that was fine. He was on vacation or something. So again, I was just mesmerized looking at that car. And one day my dad came out of the house and said, "Get in the car quick, we gotta go, we gotta go." Well, we got in the trooper's car. And he lived about 2 miles away. My dad drove it. I didn't think anything about it, but that would have probably been a no-no today. And we picked up the trooper who was waiting for us in full battle gear with these boots and breeches, and he was a very large man. And he took that about a 54 Ford wide open up the highway, and my eyes must have been that big, and I was duly impressed. And I knew right then that that was a goal. And later on in high school, I worked for my uncle who had 2 service stations in Indianapolis. And the troopers came in, and I probably hold the record for washing the most Indiana State Police cars. I've washed a lot of them. So I got to know the troopers, and that was my goal then, to be a trooper.
So you said you became a trooper in 1964.
Correct.
What was the hiring process like at that time?
In 1962, I talked 2 friends of mine into applying for the department. I was 21 years old. Well, they both made it and I didn't. So I was crushed. So they said, keep trying. I didn't weigh enough, and I really did have a baby face. So in 1963, there was an opening for an operations clerk, and someone said, if you're an employee of the department, you got a real better chance of being a trooper. If you do good, they like you, then I thought that's for me. So I got a job as an operations clerk in the state office building. At that time, Post 9 had moved from Stout Field to Sky Harbor here. But all the radio and phone answering and clerical stuff was done through the operations center. So I worked there and again got familiar with it. And I thought, well, they'll have a school and I'll go. Well, the legislature didn't appropriate the money in 1963. So I sat there working 2, sometimes 3 jobs as a young father, and they had 2 schools in '64. We had several clerks. I think there were 9 people on the department that were civilians, went to recruit school. So they made us split up. 2 clerks went to recruit school, and I had to stay in clerk. So then they both graduated, and they had to come back and clerk, which just tore them up because they were ready to be sworn. They were on the eligibility list. So that's how I got to school in '64, the second class. And then when I came out, I thought, I'll have to go back to operations. But I was fortunate, and they seemed to take care of the married men back then. And but I thought, well, I'm one of those guys that's got a job to go to, so I don't know how to work, but it worked favorably for me. I got appointed.
How were you notified about getting into academy?
A letter.
Letter. How long was academy?
2 months at the time. We started 4th of July weekend, and we got out about, I guess it was at the end of August, because we were sworn in and went to our first assignment on September 1st.
What was a typical day at academy like?
It was on Indiana University, so it really wasn't the academy then. We had a dorm that we used, and everybody was just so tight and apprehensive. They all wanted it bad, and it was there was no air conditioning. That was pretty rough. I had never been in the military, so learning to march and things like that was a goal to overcome. Where some of the fellows that had military service obviously caught on and took off right away. It was typical stuff, marching classrooms. It wasn't near as intense as it is today. A lot of classrooms, a lot of running. My gosh, we ran and ran and ran. But we would march every day about 3 blocks to the Union Building, where we took our 3 meals a day. And it was the height of the Vietnam War. And we were harassed, hassled. Every time we were on campus, the students were giving us the raspberries. And of course we were told, eyes straight ahead, don't look, don't acknowledge them. But we got our reward the last week and payback, so to speak. But it was a good experience. I learned a lot.
By payback, what do you mean payback?
We marched down this street, and we took up the whole street. And students would stand on the sidewalk. A couple of them, brave ones, one time threw some fruit at us, but that didn't work out very well for them. A couple of counselors ran them down and had a chat. But the last week, when they would stand on the sidewalk, we'd get about halfway there, and before we'd get real close to them, they'd give us a column half right, and we'd start down the street, and they had to run because we were going to mow them down. But that last week, we knew we had made it. They teach you things like firearms and some other priority things that they didn't want guys that weren't going to make it. So that was fun.
Do you remember who your roommate was?
Roger Hunalinga. Roger was a good guy. He was 20 years old. He was the youngest guy, but he was going to be 21 before September 1st.
What kind of training did you receive at academy?
A lot of academic stuff. We didn't have the facilities back then to go do different things. We had big 3-ring binders that we kept everything in. In fact, I've still got mine. I saw them not long ago. Again, the last week was firearms and first aid. I think that probably in '64, the first class maybe, but ours was one of the first that they had the riot squad, which was back there, the TIP platoon, Tactical Intervention Platoon. So they gave us the helmets and later on gas mask, and taught us defensive tactics for crowd control. So that was kind of interesting.
Did you have any difficult moments while you were at academy?
I had a little trouble marching. There was a big pothole, and I fell in it one day, and I stepped in it, and I took about 3 guys out when I fell, pushed them over. So they rewarded that kind of conduct with you marched in a goon squad. And the goon squad was about 15 paces behind the whole formation to stand out that you were the bad guy that day. So I got to spend a couple trips back in the goon squad, but it wasn't any more serious than that.
Where were you first assigned?
At the Seymour post. Bloomington was a sub post back then. So I went to Seymour. You had to live at the post then. They sent 9 troopers to the post, which was a record for Seymour. They had like 4 beds. They were remodeling the post. We had no heat through December. And the only hot water was a small, about a 20-gallon tank in the garage that the mechanic used to wash cars. So when it was time to shower at night, we would go out and take the garden hose and hold it on each other, and that was our shower. And one clown, Joe Harris, one night slipped, the highway faced US 50, and Joe raised the door and turned his headlights on, and there was about 5 or 6 of us in the process of bathing. So it was fun. It was fun, but it was tough.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any memorable experiences from your first few years as a trooper?
It just, I know the first day that I was riding with a trooper, we went to a fatal accident, and he says, "Okay, Mr. Wise Guy, you just got out of school, you do it, and I'll direct traffic." And I did it. It was a fatality in Jennings County. So that was big. Big start, yeah.
What was your first car?
1964 Plymouth 2-door, white over blue. We went, they took all, how many ever made it? 40 some, not quite 50. They took us to the garage at Stout Field after our training, and there were 49, or if there were 50, there were 49 white over blue Plymouths with the old bullet light. You know what that is? Okay. And they had one 64 Ford with a bubble light. And everybody's looking like, who is this guy and what's going on? Well, it was assigned to Jack Earnshaw, and we found out that he was at the same post I was. His dad was a Ford dealer in Greencastle, and the rumor is that his dad furnished the car if his son didn't have to drive a Plymouth. So anyway, that was and they had push-button transmissions on the left. One trooper who apparently had some misfortune driving backed into a light pole in a shopping center in Bedford, and he hit the light pole and it fell down and damaged other cars. And he, being the comedian he was, he wrote on the accident report that it was a typographical error. He put it in reverse rather than forward. I think they fired him over that.
Did you like your Plymouth?
It was fast. The only problem was when you got much above 100, that the chrome strip off around the windshield across the top would come off, and it would wrap around the bullet light. And the first time that ever happened, fortunately, I was riding with another trooper. I didn't have my car yet, because I would have probably just, I don't know what I'd have done if I'd been driving. But he said, "Oh, that'll happen about 120. But yeah, it was a good car, and it was like going a bullet on a roller skate. I mean, they were great big engines and a very small car.
What was your favorite car you had?
They bought 25 1966 Oldsmobiles, and I was lucky enough to get one. So that was a luxury back then.
Why did you like that car?
Well, it was the first four-door they had. And, you know, it was an Oldsmobile. Everybody else was driving Plymouths and Fords, and Oldsmobile had a good reputation. Plus, my father had been a car salesman all his life, and he sold Oldsmobiles, so we were both pretty happy about that.
Were you assigned to any special details like the race or the fair or anything like that?
I think I've worked everything there is except I never went to national drags because a lot of times they coincided at the same time as the state fair, and I was lucky enough to get the state fair. But I never worked the drags, but I worked the race many times. I can't remember the year, but the year that Hatcher got elected mayor, they sent half the department to Gary, Indiana, because they had just rioted in Detroit, and there was fear that they would burn Gary down if the election didn't go the way that the population wanted it. So we went up there, they put 4 guys in a room. We took the complete Holiday Inn at, it's on US 30, I'll think of the name of the town in a minute. And we were not allowed to eat any place except the Holiday Inn. They had us convinced that they were going to poison us, shoot us. We had like I think an 8-block square area. There were 2 guys in the car that we were to patrol and not leave that area. We were up there, I think, 3 or 4 days, and the crime in Gary was 0. There was 1 armed robbery, and there were 2 troopers from Jasper sitting across the street, and they had the guy before he got in the car. So we basically shut down Gary. And I guess the right person won. Hatcher was elected, and there was no rioting or disturbance. But that was, we were on the edge the whole time. You work, I think, 4 hours on and 4 hours off. Well, you couldn't go back to the hotel and sleep for 4 hours. I mean, you could after about the second day, you were so tired. But 4 guys in a room with 2 beds, but it was better than the National Guard. They were all bivouacked in tents and on the ground, so we didn't complain much.
So going back to the fair and other details, did you like working the fair?
Oh yeah, that was a piece of cake. There was no trouble. Probably the last 7 or 8 years of my career, I was assigned to the Coliseum, and that was gravy. You never had any problems. Oh, once in a while we're drunk or something like that, but got to see all the shows. Sometimes we'd help employees get their families in to see a show. And so we were pretty popular guys having access to that, but that was fun. I look forward to that.
What about the 500? Did you enjoy working the 500?
No, back then there were long, hard hours, of course no overtime. I think the last time I worked it, I was at 38th and Georgetown Road by myself from 5 a.m. to about, well, I just got in a car and left after dark because it was, but if you're familiar with 38th and Georgetown Road, that is not a one-man intersection. And, you know, you just get to the point that you just walk off over to a gas station and rest for a minute and get a drink. And I remember I got my lunch out and ate it, directed traffic. I figured somebody would take a picture and I'd get in trouble. But so that was no fun. I think the closest problem I had was I was on an intersection outside the track, and once the race started, they shut those down and you could go inside or what. I was parked on the back side just past the second turn, and I was an investigator then, but I had a marked pool car for the detail. I had been standing up in one of the observation towers watching the race, and it was very warm. And I got down, walked, sat in my car, turned the air conditioner on to eat my lunch, and I smacked a driver, and I think it was Hurtubise, I'm not sure, hit the wall, and I felt a flash of heat. Well, it was that special fuel that they use. Anyway, it burned all the paint off the car. So when I took it back to the garage, they said, "My gosh, what did you do to this car?" Well, it was a pool car waiting to be traded, so it wasn't that big a deal. But I was so fortunate that I'd got out of that observation stand because they took it. So I was lucky there.
What was your first promotion?
In 1975, I interviewed and got a job in the vehicle theft section, and 3 months later I was promoted to sergeant.
How was your new position different from your previous one?
Well, freedom, freedom, freedom. I was in plain clothes, a plain car. We dressed casual because we were basically undercover a lot of times. I loved that job. That was the best job. I didn't know much about cars, but I learned, and then later on I became commander of the vehicle theft section, and that was my best assignment. I did a lot of driving. There were 2 of us in the South, the boss, then there was 3 guys north, I think. So having half the state entailed a lot of driving, but I got to see a lot of Indiana. And then when I became the supervisor, I think I had 6 or 7 guys then. I got to do a lot of traveling around the state.
So what did the vehicle theft division do?
Well, primarily our job was to work on organized efforts to steal cars. Not so much the kid that gets in a car with the keys in it and drives it a few blocks, but the people that are stealing them, changing the identifications, making them resale, or cutting them up for parts and resale. But we were pretty successful. We got some big rings, worked the case with the Kentucky State Police, and they appreciated it more than the Indiana State Police did. They made me a Kentucky colonel with a big deal, and but I had a lot of fun. It was great.
What was the most dramatic change you saw during your career?
Drugs, crime. When I started out in Bloomington, which is a fair-sized city, everything closed at 10 o'clock at night. You couldn't get gas in Bloomington after 10. The only thing were open were a couple bars, and they closed at midnight or so. So there wasn't the armed robberies. There was no place to rob. You know, you might get 1 or 2 homicides a year. Normally they were domestics. And then later, after I kind of adjusted to the drugs and crime waves and such, I think the technology was just starting to really come, and all the improvements in communications, the portable radios, we didn't have laptops back then, but I became DIC eventually at Bloomington, and we had a lot of stuff, but it was mostly data entry, statistics, stuff like that. But I saw all that evolve, and that was very, very helpful, very rewarding. The department was good about equipment. I got to see things like improved in the clothing. I mean, we had those stupid little hats that were fur with a flap, and now they're more practical. They issue toboggans or caps and just better clothing, better equipment, but they always took good care of us.
Speaking of clothing, what was the uniform like when you first started?
Just prior, I never had one. but at one time the shirts were a little lighter color. Some of them were, and then they went to the, I don't know, the darker shirts and the pants as they are today.
What position did you hold that made you most proud?
In vehicle theft.
Commander of vehicle theft?
Yeah. And then I enjoyed my last few years as DIC at Bloomington. I had a good group of detectives, and we solved a lot of, it seemed we were getting a lot of homicides, but we had a good crew that worked hard, and you know, my motto was just stay out of their way. They know what they're doing. Just try to support them. And I enjoyed that because we were having success.
Do you want to explain a little bit further what DIC is?
District Investigative Coordinator. It's the person who supervises and coordinates all the investigations. They have a squad leader for the detectives, but you oversee him. And you coordinate with other agencies. If you're having, you know, if I got a problem, it's probably you got a problem too, whether it be burglaries or stick up armed robberies, whatever. So just to know, and even, you know, a lot of troopers work criminal cases, so it wasn't just the detectives, it was if a supervisor was working, and try to support him and help him.
So how did you transition over from vehicle theft to DIC?
Just went back to Bloomington. I was driving a lot, and just I thought a good place to wind down.
Were there any difficult cases or situations that you had to handle during your time as a trooper?
Oh yeah, there was a lot of them. One, there was I was called out in the middle of the night, apprehended drunk. He was, I got him and he stopped, and he had a female with him. And when I tried to arrest him, we were wrestling around, and we got rolled out in the highway, and cars were stopping, blowing the horn. I don't know why they didn't run over us. So I finally got him handcuffed, put him in the front seat of the car. And I put her in the back seat. Well, I only had one set of handcuffs. So we got in there, and she said, he was handcuffed behind his back. The woman said, he's got a gun, he's going to shoot you. And in my haste, and of course I'd been tussling around there and huffing and puffing, I looked, and he had leaned forward, and he had a gun in his hand pointed at me, and I was in the driver's seat. So I just opened the door and rolled out of the car. And somebody else had called the sheriff when they saw I was having difficulty. So the sheriff arrived, and they taught us always carry an extra car key. So the sheriff and I went out of his sight and everything. He couldn't get out because he was handcuffed and he had seatbelt on, but he had that darn gun. So I went back over here and distracted him, and the sheriff took my key, opened the door, and the guy had a necktie on. And the day I traded that car in, it still had a big impression in the dash where he bumped his head. So we were able to disarm him. So I got in the car, and we were going to jail, and a woman who was intoxicated reached up and slapped me in the side of the head. So I ran off the road. The sheriff was behind us, so we took her out. They fought us all the way. Well, we found out the next day that she was married to a rather notable member of the IU faculty. And the next day I went to court, and Governor George Craig had just been defeated and was practicing law in Terre Haute. And he came to represent this guy. And I thought, this is going to be rather challenging. Well, 2 days later, the woman's husband, who wasn't the guy I dealt with, murdered her and killed himself. And of course, Craig pulled enough strings that all the charges were dismissed. But that was my first, I won't say near death, but involving a gun, and real disappointment with the political system, because I'd taken a few licks over that. And I thought that justice should have prevailed, but it did not.
Were you involved in any specialty teams?
No, other than the riot squad, no.
Did you meet any interesting people during your time as a trooper, like celebrities or politicians?
Well, working in Bloomington, IU used to have people come. I was with Bob Hope for 2 days. That was kind of a funny story. I was sent to the airport to escort him and his party to their lodging. And so they had a big Lincoln Town Car parked to put him in. And I had my little 64 Plymouth there. And so he looks around, and he was doing a television show then, sponsored by Chrysler. And he said, I can't ride in this car. He said, I have a contract that I will never be in or photographed or seen in anything but a Chrysler product. So he said, well, there's a Plymouth, that'll do. So it was a little 2-door car. So he and Mo was his personal assistant, and Mo looked like he could have picked up all these cars by himself and moved them. I mean, he was a short, squat, bald-headed guy, but very capable. So Mo put the luggage in the car, and Mr. Hope got up front. And I was with him that day, and that night he performed. And then the next day. And he came back once more and he asked for me. So that was fun. I've had Petula Clark. I was with her. It was during the Vietnam War. And there was a lot of protesters. And she said, why are they protesting? And I told her. And they were all behind a fence. And she said, I want to go up and talk to them. I said, well, okay. They're not mad at you. They're mad at me because I represent the establishment. And we went up and she talked to him and for a long time, and didn't come back. And I was with her the rest of the day and that night when she performed, and she had a lot of questions. She didn't know much about Vietnam and how the citizens, especially the younger people, were so involved. That was interesting. I had Steve Lawrence and Edie Gourmet in my car, took them around. I was lucky. I guess I was good at shining shoes and shining buttons because I got a lot of those details with the dignitaries and stuff, so that was fun.
What are some things that you learned about yourself during your time as a trooper?
You get to spend a lot of time in the car by yourself thinking, and there are times people say, were you ever afraid? Of course I was afraid. I wasn't afraid's a fool. But do you go ahead and do it, or do you just turn your head and find something else to do? And I really don't blame people, but if you can't do the job, you need to realize it and quit and go home before you get somebody else hurt. But there were times, and back then, it was, when I worked Brown County, there was only 2 troopers, so you always worked by yourself. You never had anybody else. So, there wasn't call and send a couple guys. Well, that's going to be a half hour. There are no other guys. I went up there when my knees were knocking, but I got the job done. And yeah, it makes you, I think, a better people. You are a better person. You meet a lot of people, and most of them are good people. There's a few that have bad intentions and do bad things. But I had people come to me and say, you arrested me one time, and all I ever say is, did you deserve it? And I've never had one person say, no, you were wrong. So I guess that makes you feel good.
What did you learn about people in general?
Well, as I said, most people are good, have good intentions. Some people get on hard times. Some people do things that they wouldn't do if they weren't intoxicated. maybe they're having family problems, and that magnifies or transfers over into poor decisions. But yeah, and a lot of people will later come and thank you, or you did the right decision, or you did the right thing. So,
How did the world change during your time as a trooper?
I think that all law enforcement had more respect back then. A lot of the guys that went before me, when this place just started, they set the pace and they did it right. And to be honest, I think there was a little more brawn and muscle used back then. But you know, if you mouthed off to a trooper in the 1940s or 50s, you probably got smacked upside the head pretty good. And you went back and told your buddies, and people just didn't do that. I mean, you just said, I'm not going to mouth off to this guy. I'm going to get slapped if I do, or whatever. Obviously, that has went away, but I think there's a lot of people that look back and say, and I hear it, and I don't know if it's just because it's me, but we being the Indiana State Police, to enjoy a better reputation than a lot of other agencies. And I think a lot of that is because of the recruitment. At one time it was the pay with the prestige. I don't think until the last couple of years that pay has been a factor for us, a rewarding factor anyway, more of a detriment. But we have always enjoyed a good reputation as in law enforcement.
What do you want people to know about the Indiana State Police?
Well, again, we enjoy a good reputation, but I think we've earned it by being, you know, appearance is a lot. Appearance will win you a lot of battles. If you look good and sharp, and someone looks like they're squared away and comes up to talk to you, you instantly have a better opinion of this person that takes care of himself and looks as you would maybe a person that's 50 pounds overweight, needs a haircut, doesn't shine his shoes, just looks sloppy. If he comes up and starts talking to you, you're just thinking, I think I'd rather deal with this other guy. I think I'm going to get a fair shake or whatever. So the appearance and our professionalism.
Do you have any words of wisdom for young troopers or people that are considering becoming troopers?
Back then, it was a career. I wanted to be a trooper. Most of the guys that I worked with back there wanted to be a trooper. I'm afraid, and I'm not speaking for everyone, that a lot of people look back and say, excuse me, look back and say, here's a job, I can work 25 years, I'll still be relatively young, get a retirement, it's a job. And back then, at the end of your shift, very seldom did you go home. You normally, especially a weekend, you'd stay out for an hour or two with no overtime. But, you know, things have changed and people go home when the shift's over. Basically, I think that's a lot of it.
Are there any other stories you would like to share with us?
Well, I was on America's Most Wanted as an investigator. I always clarify that. My friends say, what were you wanted for? I had a homicide in Bloomington, and we were fortunate that we identified the bad guy pretty quick. And the guy took off, and he went in the victim's car. He went to Florida, he went over to California, went to Washington State, he came back, and finally the parents of the victim had talked America's Most Wanted into featuring. So they asked me, and I said, that's great if you could get it done. So they sent an investigator out. We met with the family, and they had a film crew come to Bloomington for a week, and I was kind of the liaison, and that was very interesting watching how they filmed it and did all that. So that after we knew that the bad guy was out of state we filed a federal warrant, which is unlawful flight to avoid prosecution. So the FBI got involved. So an FBI agent and I went out to Chevy Chase, Maryland, to Fox, appeared on the show, and they got several hits or phone calls, and boy, they all sounded good. And we had him all the way from Florida to California to Washington State to Arizona, but the one that sounded best was in Charlotte, North Carolina. And so they got a phone bank of people answering the phone, and these people have checklists, what they ask and all that, and this one really looked good. So we called the Charlotte, North Carolina Police Department, and they sent a detective out. He interviewed the caller, and this guy had a big tattoo of a panther on his shoulder. And this woman said, yeah, that guy works here in maintenance, and I've seen him out working in the yard, and he's got that tattoo. So the Charlotte Police Department arrested him, called us back, said it's him, he admitted it. So we were just elated. So the next day, which was a Saturday, FBI agent and I had driven to Washington, he flew. We drove down to Charlotte, interviewed the guy, interviewed the witnesses. I went to court on Monday morning. He waived extradition. We brought him back. So that got quite a bit of notoriety. It was a senseless, terrible murder of his childhood friend.
Is there anything else you would like to share with us?
No, I'm done
Okay.
with that.